The golden lights of the Jade Pavilion felt like a spotlight on a crime scene. Zara moved through the room with the quiet grace of a shadow. Her tray balanced perfectly on her fingertips. To the men at the table, she was just a part of the expensive furniture. She was the help. She was invisible. But Zara was the only one in the room truly listening. At the center of the table sat Mr. Lee. He looked like a king in his crisp white shirt, his dark hair slicked back. Across from him were two American businessmen in gray suits that cost more than Zara's rent for the next 5 years. They were smiling, but their smiles didn't reach their eyes. They were the kind of smiles people wore when they thought they had already won a game before it even started. On the mahogany table lay the contract. It was thick, bound in heavy leather, and filled with thousands of words meant to confuse. Mr. Lee's translator stood nearby, whispering in a low, steady voice. But the translator was tired, and his eyes kept drifting to the door. He was missing things. Zara stepped closer to refill the water glasses. She had grown up in a house where every penny was counted, and her father had taught her that the most dangerous weapon in the world was a pen. As she leaned in, her eyes darted to the page open in front of Mr. Lee. She didn't need to read the whole thing. She only needed to see the numbers. There it was. Page 42, Clause 12. The Americans had talked about a partnership of equals. They had promised a split of 50-50. But in the tiny, cramped print at the bottom of the page, there was an extra zero. It wasn't a mistake. It was a trap. That single zero shifted the entire debt of the project onto Mr. Lee's company. If he signed that paper, he wouldn't be building an empire. He would be signing a confession of bankruptcy. He would lose everything, his warehouses, his staff, and his reputation. Zara felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She looked at Mr. Lee. He was reaching for his fountain pen. It was a beautiful pen, silver and heavy, glinting under the chandeliers. He looked confident. He trusted the men across from him because they had broken bread together. He didn't see the way the man in the red tie was gripping his own glass, so hard his knuckles were white. The Americans were holding their breath, waiting for the ink to hit the paper. The terms are exactly as we discussed, the man in the red tie said. His voice was smooth, like honey poured over a blade. A simple signature, and we can all go home as partners. Mr. Lee nodded slowly. He uncapped the pen. The nib hovered just an inch above the white paper. Zara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew what happened to girls who stepped out of line. She knew she could lose her job in a heartbeat. But she also knew what it felt like to be cheated by someone who thought they were smarter than you. The air in the room felt thick and heavy, like it was made of lead. The zero on the page seemed to grow larger, staring back at her like a hollow eye. She looked at the bottle of red wine chilling in the bucket nearby. It was a deep, dark crimson, the color of a warning. Mr. Lee lowered the pen. The tip touched the paper, leaving a tiny dot of black ink. Zara didn't think. She didn't plan. She simply moved. She let her foot slip on the polished marble floor, a deliberate stumble that looked like a clumsy accident. As she went down, she reached for the open bottle of Bordeaux. Time seemed to slow down. She saw the shock on the American businessman's face. She saw the way Mr. Lee's eyes widened as he looked up. Then, the wine left the bottle in a violent red arc. It wasn't a splash, it was a tidal wave. The dark liquid crashed onto the center of the table. It soaked the white tablecloth, turning it a bruised purple. It splattered across Mr. Lee's pristine white shirt, spreading like a fresh wound across his chest. But most importantly, it hit the contract. The red wine soaked into the paper instantly, turning the fraudulent clause into a blurry, illegible mess of purple ink. The silence that followed was louder than a scream. "Oh my God!" Zara cried out, her voice high and trembling with a fake panic that masked her true nerves. "I am so sorry. I tripped the floor. It was so slippery." She grabbed a white cloth napkin and began to scrub at the table, but she made sure to rub the wine deeper into the signature line. She smeared the ink until the zero she had spotted was completely erased by the stain. The man in the red tie jumped back, his chair screeching against the floor. "Look what you've done." That was the original document. Mr. Lee didn't move. He sat perfectly still, looking down at his ruined shirt and the soaked papers. He didn't look angry. He looked surprised. He reached out and touched the wet paper, feeling the ruined texture of the contract. Zara kept apologizing, her head bowed low. She could feel the heat of the American's glares, but she didn't care. The contract was gone. The trap had been triggered, but it hadn't caught its prey. Mr. Lee slowly looked up from the table. His eyes met Zara's. For a second, just a tiny fraction of a second, the mask of the powerful boss slipped. He didn't see a clumsy waitress. He saw a girl who was breathing too hard to be truly accidental. He looked at the red stain on his chest, then back at the ruined paper where his name was supposed to be. The American businessmen were shouting now, calling for the manager, demanding a new copy of the contract immediately. But the moment was broken. The quiet harmony of the room had been shattered by a bottle of wine and a girl who knew how to count. "It's all right," Mr. Lee said quietly. His voice cut through the shouting like a bell. He stood up, the red wine dripping from his sleeve onto the floor. "It is just a shirt. And it is just paper." He looked at the Americans, and this time, his smile didn't match theirs. It was sharper. "I think," Mr. Lee continued, "we should take a moment to dry off. Perhaps we should read the next draft even more carefully." Zara stepped back into the shadows, her hands shaking behind her back. She had done it. She had burned the bridge before the lie could cross it. The smell of the spilled wine stayed in Zara's nose. But as she stepped into the dim hallway of the restaurant's back service area, it was replaced by a colder, sharper memory. It was the smell of recycled air and expensive floor wax. It was the smell of the 64th floor of the Miller and Associates building 2 years ago. Back then, Zara didn't wear a polyester uniform or carry a tray. She wore tailored blazers and carried a laptop that held the secrets of the city's biggest banks. She was the youngest senior auditor the firm had ever hired. They called her the Ghost because she could find a missing penny in a billion-dollar pile of digital gold. She was fast, she was smart, and she was going to be a partner by 30. The night it all ended had started just like any other. The office was quiet. The city lights twinkling outside the floor-to-ceiling windows like fallen stars. Zara was finishing a final check on a massive merger. Her boss, a man named Marcus who had mentored her for 3 years, had patted her on the shoulder that afternoon. "You're doing great work, Zara," he had said with a wide, friendly smile. "Go home early. I'll handle the final upload." But Zara couldn't leave a job half-finished. She had stayed late, her fingers flying across the keys. That was when she found it. A digital shadow. A series of transfers that didn't lead to a bank, but to a private offshore account. The numbers didn't add up. There was a hole in the heart of the company. And Marcus was the one digging it. She didn't run to the police. She didn't scream. She did what she was trained to do. She gathered the proof. She stayed until 3 a.m., downloading every encrypted file and every forged signature into a secure drive. She thought she was being a hero. She thought the firm would thank her for saving them from a thief. But when she arrived at work the next morning, her security badge didn't beep. The red light stayed red. "There must be a mistake," she told the guard at the front desk. He didn't look at her. He just pointed to 2 men in dark suits waiting in the lobby. In a small, windowless room. Marcus wasn't smiling anymore. He sat across from her, surrounded by the firm's lawyers. On the table was a printed report, a fake one. It showed that Zara had been the one moving the money. It showed that she had accessed files she wasn't supposed to touch. "We trusted you, Zara," Marcus said, his voice full of fake disappointment. "But the data doesn't lie. I have the proof," she had shouted, her voice echoing off the cold walls. "I have the drive in my bag." She reached for her purse, but when she opened it, the drive was gone. Her heart had stopped. She realized then that they hadn't just stolen her work. They had been inside her apartment while she slept. They had been one step ahead of her the entire time. By noon that day, her professional credentials had been deleted from the National Registry. Her degree was flagged as under investigation. Every bridge she had spent years building was burned to ash before she could even cross it. The industry she loved shut its doors in her face. No one would hire a thief, and no one would listen to a girl who had no proof left to show. Standing now in the shadows of the Jade Pavilion, Zara looked at her hands. They were the same hands that had once moved millions of dollars with a keystroke. Now, they were stained with red wine instead of ink. She had lost her career because she saw a lie and tried to stop it the right way. Tonight, she had seen that same lie again. The extra zero on Mr. Lee's contract was the same shadow she had seen on Marcus's screen. But this time, she wasn't going to play by the rules. She wasn't going to wait for a board of directors to save the day. She had used the only weapon she had left, a clumsy mistake. A heavy door creaked open at the end of the hall. The light from the dining room spilled across the carpet, and a tall figure stepped into the darkness. It was Mr. Lee. He had changed into a fresh shirt, but his eyes were still fixed on her, searching for the truth behind her mask. The ghost of the audit was still with her. But as Zara stood up straight and wiped the wine from her palms, she knew one thing for certain. She might have lost her name 2 years ago, but she hadn't lost her eyes. And Mr. Lee was starting to realize that his waitress was the most dangerous person in the building. The air in the Jade Pavilion felt thinner now, as if the oxygen was being sucked out of the room by the greed of the men in the gray suits. Zara stood by the mahogany side table, her fingers brushing the cool glass of a fresh bottle of Cabernet. She watched the American businessman lean over Mr. Lee's shoulder. He was pointing at the signature line with a gold pen, his voice a low, steady purr. "It's just a formality, Mr. Lee," the man said. "A bridge to our future success." Zara knew that bridge was a trapdoor. She knew that if she stepped forward and whispered the truth, she would be ignored. To these powerful men, she was just a girl who filled water glasses and cleared away crumbs. If she told Mr. Lee about the extra zero in Clause 12, the Americans would laugh. They would call it a typo. They would say she was confused or crazy. And Mr. Lee, a man who valued face and dignity above all else, might feel insulted that a waitress was trying to teach him how to read his own business deals. A verbal warning was a puff of smoke. It would vanish before it ever reached his ears. She had tried to speak the truth 2 years ago at the audit firm, and the truth had been deleted along with her career. Words were easy to twist. Words could be denied. But a physical act? That was different. A mess was undeniable. Zara looked at the contract again. It was the only original copy in the room. In the world of high-stakes deals, the wet ink signature on that specific piece of paper was the only thing that mattered. If that paper ceased to exist, the deal would be delayed. It would give Mr. Lee time to think. It would force his lawyers to print a new version, and in that second look, the lie might finally be seen. She felt the weight of the wine bottle in her hand. It was heavy, full of a dark, staining liquid that didn't wash out of white silk or expensive bond paper. She looked at Mr. Lee's white shirt. It was perfect. It was a target. Her heart hammered against her chest. If she did this, she could be fired. She could be sued. She could be thrown out into the street with nothing but the tips in her pocket. But as she watched Mr. Lee's hand move toward the pen, she realized she couldn't just stand by and watch another person's life be burned to the ground by a hidden lie. She wasn't just a waitress tonight. She was the person who knew the secret. And having the secret meant having the responsibility to act. She took a deep breath, letting the scent of the expensive wood and the floral perfume of the room fill her lungs. She had to make it look real. She had to be the clumsy girl everyone expected her to be. She would use their own bias against her as a shield. They wouldn't suspect a brilliant auditor. They would only see a tired waitress who had lost her balance. She shifted her weight, feeling the slickness of the floor. She waited for the exact moment the nib of the pen hovered over the line. The tension in the room was like a wire pulled too tight. The Americans were leaning in, their eyes hungry. Mr. Lee was calm, unaware that he was stepping off a cliff. Zara tightened her grip on the neck of the bottle. She didn't want to just spill a drop. She needed to destroy the document. She needed to make sure not a single word on page 42 could ever be read again. She needed to drown the lie in red. She felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. It was the same cold focus she used to feel when she found a mistake in a massive spreadsheet. This was just another error that needed to be corrected. She took one step forward, her eyes locked on the white paper. She felt her foot slip on a non-existent patch of oil. She let her shoulder dip. She let the tray tilt. "Oh," she gasped, the sound of her own voice echoing in the silent room. The bottle left her hand, tilting perfectly. The deep red Cabernet poured out like a dark curtain, falling through the air toward the table. It was the only way to save him. It was the only way to fight back. The wine bottle felt like a heavy stone in Zara's hand for a split second before she let it go. As she tilted her wrist, the dark red liquid didn't just drip, it surged. It was a deep, Cabernet-colored wave that seemed to hang in the air, catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. Zara watched it fall, her heart stopping in her chest. She had committed to the act. There was no going back now. The wine hit the table with a wet, heavy thud. The first splash landed directly on the center of the contract, right over Clause 12. The white paper soaked up the red liquid like a sponge, the neat black-typed words blurring and bleeding into purple clouds. Then, the rest of the bottle followed, a tidal wave of crimson that rushed across the mahogany surface. It drenched the signature line where Mr. Lee's pen had been hovering. It ruined the leather binder. It destroyed the only original copy of the lie. A large spray of the wine jumped from the table and landed squarely on Mr. Lee's chest. The white silk of his expensive shirt turned a dark, bruised color instantly. The stain spread fast, looking like a blooming rose against his heart. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that happened right after a car crash. For 3 long seconds, nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. Then, the explosion happened. "What have you done?" The man in the red tie screamed. He jumped out of his chair, so fast it tipped over, and hit the floor with a loud bang. His face turned a bright, angry red that almost matched the wine. "You clumsy, stupid girl. Do you have any idea what you just destroyed?" The other American businessman was staring at the table in horror. He reached out as if he could scoop the wine off the paper and save the contract, but his hands just got stained. That was the only signed copy. We spent months on those terms. Months. Zara dropped to her knees, making her hands shake as she reached for a stack of white napkins. "I am so sorry. Please, the floor was wet. My foot slipped. Oh, the shirt. Mr. Lee, your shirt." She began to scrub at the table, but she was careful. Instead of cleaning the paper, she used the wet napkins to smear the ink even more. She made sure that the 0 she had spotted was now nothing but a dark smudge of purple pulp. She was erasing the trap, one rub at a time. Mr. Lee still hadn't moved. He sat perfectly still in his chair, his hands resting on the edge of the table. He didn't jump back like the Americans. He didn't yell. He just looked down at the red stain on his chest, then at the ruined papers, and finally at Zara. His eyes were like dark glass. They were calm, but they were searching. He saw her frantic scrubbing. He saw the way she was intentionally blurring the lines of the contract. For a moment, his gaze locked onto hers. Zara felt a jolt of electricity run through her. In that look, she realized Mr. Lee wasn't just a boss. He was a man who noticed everything. He was seeing the accident for what it really was. "Get the manager." The man in the red tie roared, his voice shaking with pure fury. He stepped toward Zara, his fists clenched at his sides. "I want her fired. I want her arrested. This is millions of dollars down the drain because of a waitress who can't walk straight." The Americans were losing their cool. Their masks of friendly partners had slipped off completely, revealing the sharp, ugly teeth underneath. They weren't worried about Mr. Lee's ruined shirt. They were terrified because their trap had been washed away. "It is enough," Mr. Lee said. His voice wasn't loud, but it stopped the room. The American businessman froze mid-shout. Even the sound of Zara's scrubbing stopped. Mr. Lee stood up slowly. He looked at the man in the red tie with a cold, steady expression. "It is just a shirt, David. And it is just a piece of paper." "It's not just paper, Lee. It's the deal," David shouted, his face twitching. "We have to get another copy right now. We can go to my office. We can sign it tonight." Mr. Lee looked at the ruined contract. He reached out and picked up a corner of the soaked paper. The red wine dripped from it like blood. He looked at the blurred lines where the fraudulent clause used to be. A small, almost invisible smile touched the corners of his mouth. "No," Mr. Lee said quietly. "I think the wine has told us we are moving too fast. My shirt is ruined, and my appetite is gone. We will review a fresh copy of the contract in a few days. After my own lawyers have had one more look at the details." The Americans went pale. The trap was gone, and the prey had just stepped out of the cage. "Mr." Lee turned his attention back to Zara. She was still on the floor, looking up at him with wide, innocent eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean silk handkerchief. He didn't use it on himself. Instead, he reached down and handed it to Zara to wipe the wine off her own hands. "Be more careful next time, Zara," he said. His voice was smooth, but there was a secret hidden in the way he said her name. He knew. The manager's office was a small, cramped room that smelled of old coffee and bleach. Zara stood in the center of the rug, her hands clasped behind her back. Outside the heavy oak door, she could hear the muffled shouting of the American businessmen. They were still demanding her head on a platter. But inside the room, it was deathly quiet. Mr. Lee sat behind the manager's desk. He had taken off his ruined blazer, and his white shirt was still damp and stained a deep, dark red. He didn't look like a victim of an accident. He looked like a judge. The restaurant manager was hovering in the corner, his face white with fear, sweating through his uniform. "Leave us," Mr. Lee said. He didn't even look up. "But Mr. Lee, the protocol for an employee mistake of this," the manager began, his voice trembling. "Leave," Mr. Lee repeated. His voice was like a low note on a piano, heavy and final. The manager scurried out and slammed the door. Now, it was just the two of them. The silence stretched out, long and thin. Zara kept her head bowed, her eyes fixed on a loose thread in the carpet. She knew she had to keep up the act for just a little longer. "Look at me, Zara," Mr. Lee said. She lifted her head. Her heart was still racing, but she forced her face to stay soft, her eyes to stay wide and watery as if she were about to cry. "I have been coming to this restaurant for 3 years," Mr. Lee said, leaning forward. He folded his hands on the desk. "I have watched you work. You are the most efficient person in this building. You never trip. You never drop a spoon. You move like a person who knows exactly where every inch of her body is at all times." He paused, his dark eyes drilling into hers. "So tell me," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, "are you suddenly incompetent? Are you a clumsy girl who ruined a multi-million-dollar deal because she can't walk? Or is there something else happening here?" Zara felt the mask start to slip. The clumsy waitress routine was hitting a wall. She looked at the red stain on his chest and thought about the 0 she had seen on page 42. She thought about the bridge she had burned. If she kept lying now, he would just fire her and sign the paper tomorrow. The trap would just be reset. She took a deep breath. She let her shoulders drop, and the fake trembling in her hands stopped instantly. Her spine went straight, and her eyes grew sharp and cold, the eyes of the ghost from the 64th floor. "It wasn't an accident, Mr. Lee," she said. Her voice wasn't high and shaky anymore. It was calm and steady. Mr. Lee didn't blink. He just tilted his head, waiting. "You were about to sign a death warrant," Zara said. She walked over to the desk, her movements confident and precise. "You were looking at the big numbers. You were looking at the 50-50 split they promised you. But you weren't looking at clause 12 on page 42. Mr. Lee frowned. "That clause was about equipment maintenance. My translator confirmed it." "Your translator is tired, or he's in their pocket," Zara countered. "In the third paragraph of that clause, there is an extra 0 in the liability section. It doesn't say you are responsible for 50% of the debt if the project fails. It says you are responsible for 500%. Mr. Lee's eyes widened slightly. "That's impossible. It would mean they take your company, your warehouses, and your family's land the moment the first shovel hits the ground," Zara interrupted. "They didn't want a partner, Mr. Lee. They wanted a ghost. They wanted to build their empire on your ruins, and they wanted you to sign the permission slip to let them do it." She stepped closer, pointing to the red stain on his shirt. "That wine isn't a mistake. It's a firewall. I didn't just ruin a piece of paper. I destroyed the only copy of a contract that was designed to rob you blind. If I had told you with words, they would have called me a liar. They would have laughed at the help. But they can't argue with a soaked document." Mr. Lee sat back in the chair. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. The power dynamic in the room shifted. He wasn't the king, and she wasn't the servant. They were two people standing on a battlefield. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice was quiet, filled with a genuine wonder. "Waitresses don't read liability clauses in 2 languages during a dinner service." Zara felt the old sting of the audit firm, the memory of her name being erased from the computers. "I'm someone who knows what a lie looks like on paper," she said. "I'm someone who has seen a bridge burned before it was crossed. My name used to mean something in the world of finance, Mr. Lee. Now I just carry trays. But I still know how to count." Mr. Lee looked at the closed door, where the Americans were still waiting. Then he looked back at Zara. He reached out and touched the damp red silk of his shirt. "You saved me," he whispered. "I leveled the playing field," Zara corrected him. "Now you have a choice. You can go out there and apologize to them. Or you can go out there and tell them you want to see the new contract, the one without the extra 0. Mr. Lee stood up. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked dangerous. He reached for his blazer and slung it over his shoulder, covering the stain. He walked to the door, but before he opened it, he turned back to Zara. "The manager will want to fire you for this," Mr. Lee said. "I know," Zara replied. "He can't," Mr. Lee said with a small, sharp smile. "Because I just bought this restaurant 5 minutes ago in my head. You aren't a waitress anymore, Zara. You're my new consultant. And we have a lot of numbers to check. The air in the office was still thick with the smell of spilled wine and the weight of the truth. Mr. Lee stood by the door, his hand resting on the brass handle. He looked down at the red stain on his shirt one last time. It didn't look like a mess anymore. It looked like a badge of luck. He turned his head slightly to look at Zara, who stood tall and calm, her eyes reflecting the sharp intelligence of someone who had just won a war without firing a single shot. $500 million, Mr. Lee whispered. He said the number slowly, letting the weight of it sink in. That was the amount of debt he would have carried on his back the moment his pen touched that paper. It was enough to sink his family name into the dirt forever. You saved me from a $500 million mistake, Zara. He didn't wait for her to answer. He pulled his phone from his pocket and tapped a single button. Close the exits, he said into the phone. His voice was cold and hard, like ice cracking. Do not let the Americans leave the building. Bring them to the private lounge. Now. He opened the office door and stepped back into the hallway. Zara followed him, her heart thumping, but her step was steady. The manager was waiting just outside, looking like he was about to faint. Mr. Lee, I am so sorry about the girl, the manager started, reaching out to grab Zara's arm to pull her away. I'll have her out of here in a second. She's finished. Mr. Lee didn't even look at him. He simply raised a hand, and the manager froze. The only thing that is finished is your employment if you touch her again, Mr. Lee said quietly. She stays with me. They walked back toward the main dining room. The two American businessmen were standing by the coat check, looking frantic. The man in the red tie was red-faced, clutching his briefcase to his chest as if it were a shield. They were trying to push past the heavy glass doors, but two of Mr. Lee's security guards, men in dark suits who moved like shadows, were already standing in their way. Their arms were crossed, and their faces were like stone. What is the meaning of this? The man in the red tie shouted when he saw Mr. Lee. We've had an accident. We need to go back to our hotel and fix the paperwork. Let us through. Mr. Lee walked right up to them. He didn't stop until he was only an inch away from the man's face. He was taller than them, and in that moment, he looked like a mountain. The accident has already been fixed, Mr. Lee said. He reached out and tapped the leather briefcase the man was holding. My new consultant and I were just discussing the math. It seems there was a small error in your contract. A very large, very expensive error. The man in the red tie turned a sickly shade of gray. His eyes darted to Zara, who was standing right behind Mr. Lee. He looked at her uniform, then at her face. He saw the way she was looking at him. Not like a waitress, but like a predator who had finally caught its prey in a trap. Consultant? The businessman stammered. She's a waitress. She's a nobody. She spilled wine on a legal document. She is the only person in this room who can read, Mr. Lee replied. He turned to his guards. Take them to the lounge. I want their laptops. I want their files. And I want to know exactly who told them they could steal from me in my own house. The guards moved forward. The Americans tried to argue, but it was useless. They were led away, their expensive shoes squeaking on the marble floor as they were forced back into the depths of the restaurant they thought they had conquered. Mr. Lee turned back to Zara. The restaurant was quiet now, the other guests watching from a distance with wide eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold pen, the same one he was going to use to sign his life away. He handed it to her. I think it's time we look at the real numbers, he said. Shall we go to work, Zara? Zara took the pen. It felt heavy and warm in her hand. She looked at the door where the men had been taken, then back at the man who had just changed her life. The ghost was gone. She was finally back in the light. The private lounge of the Jade Pavilion was cool and quiet, a sharp contrast to the chaos of the dining room. Mr. Lee sat in a deep velvet chair, his eyes fixed on a tablet screen. He wasn't looking at the wine-stained contract anymore. He was looking at a digital folder that had just been delivered to his private email. Across from him, Zara sat perfectly still. She had washed the wine from her hands, but her waitress uniform felt like a costume that no longer fit. She watched Mr. Lee's face as he scrolled through page after page of encrypted files. His jaw tightened, and a small, dangerous spark lit up in his eyes. Miller and Associates, Mr. Lee said, his voice dropping to a low growl. The firm that handled the audit for the Americans. The firm that swore this deal was clean. Zara felt a cold lump form in her throat. That is the firm where I used to work, she said quietly. Before the audit. Before the theft. Mr. Lee looked up from the screen. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her with a new kind of respect. I have my own team of investigators, Zara. They work fast. They don't just look at what is on the surface. They dig into the trash that people think they have burned. He turned the tablet around so Zara could see it. On the screen was a photo of her old boss, Marcus. He was standing on a balcony, laughing with the man in the red tie, the same man who had just tried to rob Mr. Lee. The date at the bottom of the photo was from 2 years ago, just 1 week after Zara had been fired and her reputation ruined. They didn't just fire you because you found a mistake, Mr. Lee explained, his finger tapping the screen. They framed you because you were the only one smart enough to stop a much bigger plan. Marcus wasn't just stealing from his firm. He was building a bridge for these Americans. He was clearing the path so they could move into this city and swallow up companies like mine. Zara felt the world tilt. For 2 years, she had carried the weight of her shame like a heavy stone. She had believed she was alone, a girl whose life had been erased by a powerful man's lie. But seeing the photo changed everything. She wasn't a victim of bad luck. She was a witness to a crime that was still happening. They used your name as a shield, Mr. Lee continued. They told the board of directors that you were the thief so that no one would look at the real accounts. They deleted your credentials so that no one would ever listen to your warnings again. They thought they had buried you under a mountain of fake evidence. He leaned forward, his shadow falling across the table. But they made a mistake. They forgot that a ghost can still see. And they never expected you to be standing in this restaurant tonight with a bottle of wine in your hand. Zara reached out and touched the screen. She saw the digital trail of her own crimes, the fake transfers, the forged signatures, the logs that said she had logged in at 4 a.m. when she had actually been asleep in her bed. It was all there. But now, under the light of Mr. Lee's resources, the lies looked thin and weak. My team found the offshore account, Mr. Lee said. It wasn't yours, Zara. It was registered to a shell company owned by Marcus and his friends in the gray suits. They didn't just take your job. They stole your life to pay for their mansions. A strange feeling washed over Zara. It wasn't just anger. It was a cold, sharp clarity. The bridge they had burned hadn't just been hers. It was a bridge they used to sneak into the city. And tonight, by spilling that wine, she had accidentally tripped the alarm on a 2-year-old robbery. What happens now? Zara asked. Her voice was steady, but her heart was hammering against her ribs. Mr. Lee stood up and straightened his blazer. He looked like a man who was ready to go to war, and for the first time in her life, Zara felt like she had a general on her side. Now, Mr. Lee said, his eyes locking onto hers, we don't just fix the contract. We exhume the past. We show the world exactly what was hidden in those deleted files. And then, we make sure Marcus and his partners find out exactly what happens when they try to bury someone who knows how to fight back. He walked toward the door, then stopped and looked back at her. Change out of that uniform, Zara. We have a meeting with the police, and then we have a firm to dismantle. I think the ghost has haunted them long enough. It's time they saw the real you. Zara stood up, her head held high. The heavy stone of shame she had carried for 2 years finally fell away, leaving her light and dangerous. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Mr. Lee's private office, turning the glass buildings of the city into pillars of gold. Zara stood by the window, looking down at the streets where she had walked as a nobody only a few days ago. She was no longer wearing the black polyester vest of a waitress. She wore a sharp, navy blue suit that felt like armor. Behind her, she heard the soft rustle of paper. Mr. Lee was sitting at his wide glass desk. He didn't look tired. Even though they had spent the last 48 hours working with the police and the National Audit Board, the red wine stain was gone, and the Americans were in a holding cell. But the real work was only just beginning. Come here, Zara, Mr. Lee said. His voice was warm, but it still had that steady power that made people stop and listen. Zara turned and walked to the desk. Lying on the polished surface was a thick blue folder. It didn't look like the scary, confusing contracts the Americans had tried to use. It looked clean. It looked honest. Before we talk about the future, we have to bury the past, Mr. Lee said. He pushed a single sheet of paper toward her. Zara picked it up. Her hands didn't shake this time. It was an official letter from the National Registry of Auditors. It had a gold seal at the bottom and a signature from the head of the board. She read the words slowly, letting each one sink into her mind. Exonerated. Reinstated. Error corrected. The letter stated clearly that the theft 2 years ago had been a frame-up. The digital files had been restored, and her name was once again listed at the very top of the professional registry. Marcus and his friends thought they could delete you, Mr. Lee said, watching her face. But they forgot that the truth is harder to kill than a computer file. Your record is clean, Zara. You are no longer the ghost. You are a senior auditor with a perfect reputation. Zara felt a lump in her throat. For 2 years, she had looked at herself in the mirror and seen a failure. She had hidden her face in the shadows of a restaurant, hoping no one from her old life would recognize her. Now, the shadow was gone. She felt like she could finally breathe again. Thank you, she whispered. I didn't think anyone would ever believe me. I didn't just believe you, Mr. Lee corrected her. I saw you. And what I saw was a person who is far too talented to be carrying trays for the rest of her life. He flipped open the blue folder to the very last page. There was a signature line at the bottom, but it wasn't the kind of signature line she was used to seeing. This is not an employment contract, Mr. Lee said. I don't want a servant, and I don't want a girl who just catches mistakes. I want a partner. This document creates a new department within my company, an oversight division. You will lead it. You will have the power to check every deal, every contract, and every penny that moves through my empire. Zara looked at the terms. It was a partnership of equals. It offered her a seat at the board table, a share of the profits, and the resources to make sure what happened to her never happened to anyone else. There were no hidden zeros. There were no traps in Clause 12. You saved me $500 million, Mr. Lee said with a small smile. Consider this your commission. But more than that, consider this a chance to build a bridge that actually leads somewhere. Zara looked at the silver fountain pen sitting on the desk. It was the same pen Mr. Lee had been holding when the wine splashed across the table. She picked it up. The weight of it felt familiar and right. She looked at Mr. Lee. You're trusting me with a lot. You trusted yourself when no one else did, he replied. That is the only kind of partner I want. Zara lowered the pen to the paper. She didn't hesitate. She signed her name in bold, clear letters. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't signing a confession or a lie. She was signing a promise to herself. The ink dried quickly, black and permanent. Mr. Lee stood up and reached across the desk to shake her hand. His grip was firm and honest. Welcome back to the world. Zara, he said. Zara looked out at the city again. The buildings didn't look like giants meant to crush her anymore. They looked like opportunities. She had started the week as a girl who spilled wine to stop a crime. She was ending it as the woman who was going to make sure the truth always had a seat at the table. The glass towers of Seoul reached into the clouds, reflecting the bright morning sun. High above the city, in a room made of polished steel and soft gray stone, the air was cool and quiet. A long table of dark wood sat in the center of the room. It was the kind of table where people made decisions that changed the world. Zara walked into the room first. She didn't have a tray in her hands, and she didn't have to wait for someone to tell her where to stand. She wore a tailored suit that was the color of a deep, midnight sky. Her hair was pulled back, and her eyes were calm. Behind her walked Mr. Lee and a team of legal experts. They followed her lead because they knew she was the smartest person in the building. Across the table sat a group of international investors. They looked nervous. They had heard stories about the woman who could see through any lie. They had heard about the ghost who had returned from the shadows to become the shield of Mr. Lee's empire. They kept their briefcases closed and their voices low. Zara pulled out a chair at the head of the table. She didn't look like a girl who had ever been afraid. She looked like she belonged there. On the table in front of her was a new contract. It was thick, but it was honest. There were no hidden clauses and no extra zeros. She had spent the last 3 nights checking every single letter herself. The room was silent as the lead investor began to speak. He talked about synergy and growth, using big words to try and sound powerful. Zara listened with a small, knowing smile. She had heard it all before. She knew that power didn't come from big words. It came from the truth. As the man spoke, Zara reached for a crystal pitcher on the table. It was filled with ice-cold water. Next to it sat a delicate glass that sparkled under the lights. The room went even quieter as everyone watched her. They remembered the story of the clumsy waitress. They remembered the red wine that had ruined a $500 million trap. Zara grasped the handle of the pitcher. She didn't hesitate. She didn't shake. Her hands were perfectly steady, as solid as the mountains outside the city. She poured the water into the glass, the clear liquid swirling and dancing without a single drop hitting the table. It was a simple act, but it was a message. It told everyone in the room that she was in total control. She was no longer the girl who had to break things to be heard. She took a slow sip of the water and set the glass down on the wood. It didn't make a sound. "The terms on page 15 are acceptable," Zara said. Her voice was clear and reached every corner of the room. "But we will be changing the interest rates in Section 4. We want a deal that is fair for everyone, not just a deal that is good for you." The investors looked at each other. They knew they couldn't argue. They knew that Zara had already seen every move they were planning to make. One by one, they nodded. They opened their pens and prepared to sign a contract that was actually worth the paper it was printed on. Mr. Lee sat next to her, a look of pride on his face. He didn't have to say a word. He had given Zara the chance to find her voice, and now she was using it to lead them into a future that was clean and bright. When the meeting was over and the signatures were dry, Zara stood up and looked out the window. The city below was busy and loud, full of people trying to find their way. 2 years ago, she had been lost in that crowd, a ghost with no name and no hope. Now, she was the one holding the pen. She looked at her hands one last time. They were clean. They were strong. The red stain of the past was gone, washed away by her own courage and the truth she had refused to let die. The bridge was no longer a trap. It was a path she had built for herself. "Ready to go, partner?" Mr. Lee asked, standing by the door. Zara picked up her folder and smiled. It was a real smile, one that reached her eyes and stayed there. "Ready," she said.